You're listening to the Talking Headways Podcast Network. This is Talking Headways, a weekly podcast about sustainable transportation and urban design. I'm Jeff Wood. This week we're joined again by author Chuck Wolfe to talk about his book, Sustaining a City's Culture and Character. We talk about sustainable travel and the, quote, character and authenticity of places. We also talk in detail about the importance of context. Stay with us. Today's podcast is brought to you by Land Matters, the podcast of the Lincoln Institute of Land Policy. We've shared a few of the episodes on our Monday show, but I want to make sure folks hop on over for a behind-the-scenes look at what makes cities tick. Every month, Anthony Flint interviews leading experts, policymakers, and thinkers on topics ranging from housing to climate change to infrastructure, exploring how these issues can all be traced back to land. Some of my favorite recent interviews feature leaders like Lisa Rice of the National Fair Housing Alliance discussing racism and housing policy, and Bill McKibben on decarbonization. So open up your podcatcher and add Land Matters from the Lincoln Institute of Land Policy. Find it on Apple, Spotify, Stitcher, or wherever you get your podcasts. Today's podcast is brought to you by our super generous Patreon supporters. Thanks so much for supporting each month. And if you are a Patreon supporter, we just posted bonus materials with Laura Schul of Streetlight Data at patreon.com/theoverheadwire. We've started doing more bonus materials that enhance the initial episode, so check them out if you're a supporter. And if you're not a Patreon supporter and wish to join our merry band of transportation nerds and zoning wizards, go to patreon.com/theoverheadwire. $2 a month and you'll get a handwritten note and some stickers. $10 a month and you'll get our bus-only scarf. Appreciate everyone that has supported and continues to support the show. And for a free trial of our 15-year-old Daily Cities newsletter, or for access to our audiobook version of Raymond Unwin's 1909 classic Town Planning and Practice, go to theoverheadwire.com. Our newsletter is the oldest and the best in the business because we share information about what everyone else is doing. So check it out if you get a chance, and I'm sure you'll enjoy it. Oh, and before we get started chatting about Chuck's book, at the end of the show he mentions a 30% discount code with the publisher. The code is 4S21CITY. That's 4S21CITY. Okay, let's talk to Chuck. Well, Chuck Wolfe, welcome back to the Talking Headways podcast.
It's been, 4 years?
Yeah. It's been 4 years. April of 2017, I believe, this was when the episode 138 came out. So we're now we just released 335 this morning. And
oh my God.
Yeah.
That's what a pandemic will do for you. Yeah.
Well, we started in 2013. So we've been, pandemics or not, we're still going strong. I appreciate that for sure. But yes, it gives you more time to get on the horn and talk with people and read more books and get involved a little bit more. Before we get started, though, can you tell the listeners who might not have listened to episode 138 a little bit about yourself?
Well, I'm a different person than I was in episode 138, I guess. But the short story, I think, that is material to our chat today is that I'm a recovering lawyer now, a recovering American lawyer who lives in the United Kingdom. And I've lived here for 3.5 years. I live in a town called Newbury, about 45 miles west of London. And really the reason I'm here has to do with how you and many others helped advance a whole other angle of what I do after I wrote my second book, Seeing the Better City, then morphed into this third book that I think we're going to talk about today. But the short story is I'm a former American lawyer, now I guess a mixture of urbanism consultant and visiting scholar in Sweden, and always material to my writing and chats are that I'm the son of an American planning professor of some note back in the 50s, 60s, 70s, 80s, back in the land that time forgot.
I love reading your books because I get some history about you. And this book is no exception. The building where the Indian restaurant was, the memories from those types of things. And you take it with you. And it's really fascinating to see that. I'm curious, going to Europe, how you've changed from maybe when you were in Seattle.
Wow, that's an interesting question. I probably haven't fully figured out the answer to yet. But I was very, very, very fortunate as a youngster to be able to travel with the father who I referenced. And as I think I mentioned in episode 138, I'm sort of an urbanism by osmosis kind of person. And therefore, I cannot separate the personal from the professional and the academic when it comes to the topic of urban planning. Hence, I think I'm just on an extended, new and improved journey of what I was always on. And I got distracted by a legal career that, as I think I told the story last time, began to erode in 2009 when I started writing about cities. And yeah, it's intrinsic. I think I've discovered that if I write about an urbanism topic, if I write, these books, they sort of, I mean, and I don't mean it in a self-indulgent way, they sort of parallel my personal journey. And so if I'm beginning to think about a new way of looking at cities, I have to reflect back on where I've been, just as I'll reflect back on how practice is morphing to reflect new trends, or academia is picking up a new focus on X, Y, or Z.
And that's a good question, is like, what have you learned from book 1 to book 3? And, I think I wrote down, did you not learn your lesson the first 2 times?
Yeah. Well, you're using a dangerous word, learn, because it turned into an operative acronym for the method that I'm suggesting might help us in these times. But the quick evolution of what I now call the trilogy is that, Urbanism Without Effort, which was originally an ebook from Island Press and was actually republished in 2019, second edition. That had a very simple premise, and that is, before we go forward, we need to understand, to coin a phrase, who we really are and the fundamental relationships between people and where they live. We need to rediscover those, go back to first principles before we adopt the flavor of the day of placemaking or tactical urbanism or this or that, which are all trends that I support, but can be a little bit jocular about sometimes. We need to really go back to the basics. And so what I did there is set out some fundamental principles. And then I also came up with this tool called the Urban Diary. And for me at that time, it was very photocentric because I'm kind of manic about cameras and taking photos and so on and so forth. Seeing the Better City, which came 4 years later, was the implementation book. It was how to do urban diaries, how to understand the city, how maybe even to make these urban diaries advocacy or supplemental regulatory tools to improve the dialogue about urban change. And then things really started happening, as I alluded to before, because that book got a fair amount of play, and episode 138 and beyond, I ended up going to several American cities. And then I was on inadvertently a 14 talk, 8 city tour in Australia after the last time I saw you in San Francisco in June of 2017. That fall, I was in Australia for a month. And then I got a gig in Sweden that December. And then I got a Fulbright opportunity in Australia the following summer. And at the same time, my wife had gotten a great opportunity here in the London area. I was so all over the place, it made more sense for me to be here and to sort of wind down the law practice. And what I learned was that Seeing the Better City was a bit too, or overly two-dimensional. There I focused on the physical environment and what one sees, and then sort of woke up through the process of dealing with the realities of talking about the book and being repetitively interviewed about the book and being sort of the outside expert that could be easily resented. I learned a lot of things about access to technology, about challenged populations who could not necessarily easily follow suit of the prescriptions from that book, about people who couldn't see and who needed other ways of articulating their understanding of the city. And so it led to the third book as essentially a research project during my time in Sweden, an affiliation I still have for a few more months, that really looked at cities far more comprehensively and interdisciplinarily. And the Urban Diary became the Urban Diary plus, plus, plus. And the lens method from Seeing the Better City, look, explore, narrate, and summarize, became the learn method of sustaining a city's culture and character, the new book, meaning look, engage, assess, review, and negotiate. And so what you're hearing is a sort of a richness that's reflective of multicultural exposures, a wide range of interactions with people from different places. I would say a realization of how big the world really is and how aided by the pandemic, how little we all might matter in the end. And so a lot's happened between the books.
Yeah, a lot how we maybe don't matter, but also how little maybe we don't know or understand about different places, I imagine. I mean,
Right.
you talked about earlier being a little self-indulgent. I've mentioned on the podcast before that I'd love to go to a number of different cities around the world and live there for a year. And that would require me to be 1,000 years old, I imagine, which would be a little bit self-indulgent, but to immerse yourself in that place so that you actually get to live in the place, not just visit the place. And I think that comes across in your book a little bit in terms of, the discussions about tourism and authenticity and all those things.
Yeah, I think that's right. Because all kidding aside, what really happened is I realized how, while now I may be a little bit intolerant when American tourists return to London and they don't want to see all the interesting, cool stuff that I've learned. They want to go to a pub and they want to go to the Tower of London and they want to go to the landmarks and so on and so forth. Well, again, I'm being tongue in cheek because I realized how little I knew and how literally the understanding of a place and one's relationship to it is so conditioned by my and many others magic word context. And this new book, as Matthew Carmona, who's a leading urban design academic at University College of London, he very kindly said that this is a book about context. It's a thoughtful book about context. And so I'm agreeing absolutely with what you said. I learned tons about context, perspective, the importance of a variety of voices, and how we indulge in a lot of fantasies with our expectations for what places are and could be. I think if I were to be self-indulgent, I would say one part of the book that I'm particularly grateful I came up with before the pandemic says in so many words, and I tried to make it a little bit lyrical. Imagine if the world around you disappeared and the places with which you were so familiar suddenly went away. Your roots or of travel are gone. How would you reinvent? Certainly you wouldn't reinvent the Athens of ancient Greece. You would reinvent James Joyce's Dublin. What would you do? And of course then the pandemic happened and I thought, wow, I'm onto something here.
What would you do? What have you done?
What have I done? I've immersed because of the pandemic, both in London and here in Newbury. And I've used my driver of photography, but I've also tried to put my money where my mouth is and test out this learn method, which is learn and the context keys of learn. In a sense, they're a provocation. They're action forcing approaches to really understanding a place. And I've tried to do that. And for instance, last week, my wife and I took a week off because May 17th was a magical day in England. It was the most significant level of reopening from lockdown yet, from the third lockdown here. And so suddenly the indoor pubs and hotels were open. So we live 45 miles from London. We also live about 60 miles from Bristol. And we walked west on the Kennet and Avon Canal. It took about 6 or 7 days doing so and ended up in Bristol. And looking hard at Bristol, which I'd heard a lot about, but I'd never actually been there, I started thinking actually about why I'm interested in what I'm interested in and how, with respect to a particular redevelopment in a very prominent area of town that's slated to regenerate an area that was originally bombed out in World War II, the developers are doing a same old redevelopment approach that looked so much like everywhere else. And I really was able to think critically about what I saw and also hypothesize some of the cultural issues that were inherent in what was planned and how it was they were purporting to hear from the public. And, they had their 3D visualization, which includes the bike shops and the greening and the restored bombed out church. And I realized that I was looking at things somewhat, like I said, with respect to what I'm preaching, if it can be called that. And So that's what I've done. I've tried really hard to use this time to think about what I'm really trying to do with all of this, why it matters, and really why I care that people look more comprehensively than just take the easiest way out of the conundrum of urban change.
And it's interesting to talk about change and talk about places that kind of restructure themselves the same way, I guess, globally. And, we did an audiobook of Raymond Unwin's Town Planning and Practice. We turned it into an audiobook. And it's interesting to see that some of the same issues that are going on then in 1909, even previous, are going on now. I mean, he talks about the change of vernacular because of the railroads, and you don't have the same design anymore because you can get materials from anywhere. And that is just gone global, it feels like, in the last so many years. And you talk about this in the book to a certain extent. And you mentioned the Umbrellas Project, which is something that's kind of similar in that way. That is it transformative? Is it something that social media is changing about the world? I'm
Right.
curious what makes vernacular and the introduction of social media, what makes things so hard to separate these days from that kind of that feeling of culture of a local place versus a global culture?
Mm-hmm. Well, I think you're right. Social media and all of the globalism trends certainly play their part. In being originally a Seattle boy, when I look around and see Starbucks, Costco, Boeing, Microsoft, Amazon, as they say it here,
Amazon?
the Amazon. I mean, come on, it's so apparent that, all of the truisms about connectedness are undeniable. So it's hard, but I can tell you that living here, and I do talk about a lot of this in the book, and I riff, as I recall, I riff about maybe the taste of food or some spellings or a UK keyboard versus an American keyboard.
Your neighborhood,
Yeah,
neighborhood.
yeah. I mean, and I know that I speak differently than I used to. I enunciate more because I've been locked down here for a year and a half. I mean, I haven't talked to that many Americans. And so, one develops, not just me, one develops some, survival skills, if you will, so that people don't think you're an American tourist, right? I just did it. I just did
Right.
it. Right, right. I mean, that's a way of interacting here that, a conversational tone that also asks a question, which I find very alluring, quite honestly. So it's something I've adopted. There's all these subtleties, and that's what the book is trying to get at, not necessarily as a linguist or or as an ethnographer or so on and so forth. But I can assure you there's still many differences. One of my big heroes in the book is the great universalist Plamen the Handyman, who is a guy from Bulgaria who did some weekend work. He came in when we were still living in a flat before we bought our house. We were still living in a flat in London, and he came in as with one of the companies that the landlord used to fix something. And I had him come in and moonlight for £100. He painted a ceiling or something that the landlord refused to do. And, at the end, he said, "So, do you like it here?" Because he knew I wasn't from England originally. And I said, "Yeah, how about you? Do you like it here? Where are you from?" And he said, "Bulgaria." And I said, "Oh, well, what do you think?" And he goes, "Well, everywhere's the same, but it's just different things are better and different things are worse. Some places the food is better. Some places transport, as they call it here, is better. I looked at him and I said, "Could you repeat that? That's absolutely brilliant." And so I do refer to him twice because he really nailed it. And it probably reminded me of those original urbanism without effort days, when I was trying to argue for a certain simplicity before we go forward. But it is hard. I mean, your point is very well taken that, I mean, I feel like I'm indulging in just cliche, but we're more connected than ever and so on and so forth. But even looking at the roots out of the pandemic and how the US is responding and how the UK has responded after learning the hard way. I'm going to Seattle and Portland for the first time since February 2020 in 2 weeks. I'm really not supposed to yet here. The only reason I can do it is because I'm an American citizen. The US is on the amber list. I hate to tell you how many COVID tests I just ordered, even though I'm double jabbed, as they say here.
Mm-hmm.
I follow things back home pretty regularly, and there's lots of differences in the world still. Yeah, some good, some not so good, some understandable, some not understandable. There was a brilliant piece early in the pandemic written in the Times of London, which I do refer to in the book, where David Aronovich, one of the columnists, said that one thing that's going to come from this, and this was like in the first 2 weeks, he said, was that young people as a whole are going to realize how interconnected the world really is. And that's certainly happened. But the question now, after sort of being marginalized as individuals, what role can we play coming out of this, begins to bring back this issue about, well, what is the role of experience as opposed to the inevitability of things? And I think that's really important. I wrote a lot of blog pieces last summer about emerging from the pandemic and bicycling streets and alfresco dining and all of the things we've all written about, how, oh yes, the pandemic has accelerated trends that were already under the way, and working from home and so on and so forth. That's really not the whole picture. Then there's the second tier: what's going to happen to our high streets or main streets in the American parlance? Well, that gets a little more sophisticated. We can fill empty spots with commercial space, can become housing if we change the rules. Same stuff that's going on anyway. But then it gets really interesting with stories like the one I tell in the book, like the old Covent Garden fruit stall, Covent Garden now being essentially a touristic theme park. A guy who actually sold fruit when Covent Garden was the fruit and vegetable market of London. He went from that stall to 5 brick and mortar, if you will, food stalls at various tube stops, to a realization that wasn't making money anymore. So they went all online, and they operate out of a warehouse in a rail arch. And they carry with them the same customer service spirit that they always did. They're still active in the communities where they were once physically located. That's the story of what's going on in the world, I think. That it's not all doom and gloom. It's things blend, things morph, things change. The physical environment reflects that. But there's these undercurrents that are fascinating, that are, essentially not readily visible until you are located in a place long enough to understand. And I think the point I make in that section is, well, bobtail fruit, as it's called, some tourists would think that's a story of failure because they don't have a stall in the touristically oriented borough market in Southwark, and it's like, no, they actually are doing quite well, and they're still the same family. And by the way, I never would have known their story unless I totally immersed by doing the work to tell the story of the We Are Waterloo Business Improvement District. I met them in that context. And so, I don't always feel, and it may be just the pandemic, I don't always feel that people are interested enough in those types of stories. I think the vernacular is harder to find. That's why I guess I felt the need to help people try and figure it out.
Yeah, it's so interesting. Here living in San Francisco, you have a vernacular, but that came from Victorian time, right? The time frames. And it makes me think of something that I thought of kind of consistently while reading the book, is that, we create these places, and some of these places have been around for 500 years. Some of them have been around for 1,000 years. Some of them have been around for less than 50 years. And so what is authenticity in each of those different time frames, right? How does that change over time?
Right. That's where context comes into it too.
Yeah.
But as you know, because you've been kind enough to read the book, I just trash on those words like authenticity without knowing what they mean. And character, I reference a lot of people before me who point to character as sort of an assemblage of many different things. Character actually being this holistic concept, but some people think it's only architecture. Some people think it's only a cultural attribute. I wax poetic and riff on that a lot to try and help people just take these words apart, because Oh, when a downtown business organization in the United States talks about creating authentic downtowns to foster economic resilience, and then they list attributes that really are not about authenticity at all, they're about livable places. I came to realize that if one wants to be politically unpopular, and perhaps people should be called out on that lack of critical thinking. Hence, I did so.
Yeah, I noticed that you were upset with the list, the list they got made for downtowns.
Yeah, I was upset with the list, and I think that it's only through, maybe I'm just being a bit impetuous because, per my earlier answer, there's so much I've learned about what I thought was authentic, and then I realized it's not authentic at all. And as you know from the book, I start out with some pretty wild premises, like talking about the Sherlock Holmes Museum on Baker Street, and there it is. There's where Sherlock Holmes lived. So it sure looks authentic and all that. Well, of course, it never existed.
Yeah, platform 9 3/4.
Yeah, exactly. All of those things that people flock to see that, in one sense, didn't even ever exist. But you see, I think another way I've changed is the people I hang out with, and so I've learned an awful lot from people who are from different professions, from artists, futurists, quasi mystics, people who've said, a place is real if you can imagine it. It's like, wow. That's the same person who said to me, why is sustainability something we should aspire to if we're only sustaining the mediocre? And my mouth dropped. So again, these are the pieces of learning that I've achieved by taking myself out of my comfort zone. And it hasn't all been much fun, I assure you.
Yeah, you talk about authenticity. One of the interesting parts is you kept bringing up the Cinque Terre, and I was there in 2009, partially because just north of there is a place where part of my family's from, and so we went to go to the village in the hills where my family came from, and so we thought we'd go visit the Cinque Terre, and I really like the place, but it is something that I worry about, and you discussed this about over tourism and tourism of places that
right
everybody wants to see, and so. What does that mean? Do you congestion price a tourist area? Do you try to get people to go other places that maybe aren't as well traveled by tourists? It's an interesting kind of conundrum. It's an amazingly beautiful place. And for me, it's a little bit of a connection to, my ancestry.
Yeah.
But it's dangerous.
By the way, not too far from there was the Umbrella Sky Project. Umbrella is in an Italian hill town that one could say, what the heck are these doing here out of context? Or is this a good thing for this little artisanal street in this hill town that's way interesting without those umbrellas? Yeah, I mean, I talk about the Cinque Terre in, I think, all three of my books, just because of the issues it raises. And in chapter 4, I think, where I do talk about global v local and so on and so forth, that would be one place that I would raise such issues and borrow ideas from others about how to create slow tourism, or forms of tourism that honor the intrinsic nature of the place without overdoing them. That is something that fortunately hasn't been a problem the last year and a half, but will soon be a problem again. Don't kid oneself. And I think as places like Venice look hard at whether they really want to be what they were, the question becomes how to create experiences maybe for people that aren't quite so driven by fantasy and are more consistent with what the day-to-day might really be, and making that day-to-day life of more interest to tourists. Because some of the studies of over-tourism will tell you that you can make a list of those places that exhibit the symptoms, and there's a vast swath of under-visited places, so to seem, that have every interesting attribute that people think they're going to find by going to Prague, Venice, Barcelona, and the usual bucket list. I mean, it's not that simple, but the bucket lists, I think, are very dangerous, because they create some of the sustainability issues we're dealing with. And if only people would realize that there are so many places that I believe are more interesting uh, if one looks a little bit deeper.
One of my favorite things whenever my family and I go traveling, we go, maybe once every 3 years or 4 years or so. And generally it's to Western Europe. But one of the things that I love is the Cadogan Guide. I think it's some British guidebook makers. And I don't know if they make them anymore. Maybe they are limited in their printing. But when we went to Italy, we went to the Italian Alps. We went to Turin. We went to Milan. We went to Alba and Bra. We went to the Cinque Terre. It was quite a trip. And I'd never been to Florence and I'd never been to Rome and anything like that. But this is kind of like a family type of, check it out, see kind of the places in northern Italy where your family might have come from. And I found the Cadogan Guides were really valuable in that if you studied them, if you went deep into them, you could find things like harp museums that maybe 5 people went to a day. And you could find the place where they sew the velour for the palio in Siena. We went there. It's actually just north of the Cinque Terre. And this little old lady let us into the sewing room and showed us how they made them. And nobody else had come probably that day, and maybe nobody else would have come the next day. It was just a house on the side of a road. And so, those experiences, I think, make travel interesting, but it also, you have to do more work to get there. And I think it's hard for people to do that work when there's already been work done, Rick Steves or otherwise. And I love Rick Steves, and he's, Seattleite.
Sure is,
but
yeah.
There's so much to uncover in places that maybe we haven't uncovered.
Right. I mean, we just experienced that walking this particular canal I mentioned. I mean, there's some amazing places that we saw just because the Cicerone, which is a walking guide company, the guy who wrote the Cicerone book, some of the things he noted along the way were just, fascinating. If you've ever watched, for instance, The Last Kingdom, which was, story of Alfred the Great, essentially the last kingdom other than the Danes, and the King of Wessex and so on. There's a rise called a tump where he and his brother rendezvoused to go north to fight the Danes in 879, and you walk by on the canal and you see this thing, and it's pretty incredible. I mean, I think that's authentic, but speaking of Rick Steves, 2 stories. One, people accuse him of being single-handedly responsible of turning Vernazza and the Cinque Terre into a shell of what it was, with rooms to let and Airbnbs and so on and so forth, because he popularized the Cinque Terre in his books. I knew him a little bit from his early days at the University of Washington and teaching a course at the experimental college, and I saw him speak some years later, and I asked him about Puglia, the heel of the boot in Italy, where I had recently spent some time. He spent no time there whatsoever, and that at the time was kind of a burgeoning, one of the early slow travel places where you go work on a farm for your week and that kind of thing. And I was already beginning to see a distinction between a more customary form of tourism and a new form of tourism that is sustainable in the sense of taking the assets of a place and working with them to gain interest from outside, but also enhance what the region is known for. And I think that whole movement, as I say in the book, has a lot to offer for urban neighborhoods in these times when we're trying to figure out how to co-create, meaning bottom up and top down, solutions.
Yeah, and I don't want to be too hard on Rick Steves. I enjoy his work on PBS. I enjoy learning about places. Like his trip to Iran was infinitely fascinating. It's a place that really not a lot of Americans can go to. But it's interesting to think about the ways in which certain promotions can push people to go certain directions.
Yeah, and I mean, there are so many examples that we could talk about things that became very successful that ended up, because of their economic consequences often, or bringing a higher flow of people, ended up leading some people to believe that the place had been ruined. And I spend some part of chapter 4 telling the the Amazon story and how the incentives created, the competition of a couple of years ago and so on and so forth. And I think the reason that's important for a discussion about sustaining the culture and character of a city or sustaining city life in an inclusive way is that obviously, in the end, it often comes back to economic opportunity for companies and people who need income to survive. And so the question is, well, how does one overcome a juggernaut that's created by opportunity? Another thing that I learned in getting the opportunity to speak about these books and so on is, I had an experience, which I talk about in the book, in Portugal about 2 years ago, where I was speaking in some towns in the Portuguese interior. They're losing their youth to Lisbon and Porto, and they were absolute cultural, architectural meccas, but they needed jobs to keep their young people. They sometimes, this is a gross overgeneralization, but let's just say based on the topic we're discussing, they will do things without remembering who they are. And I literally had the opportunity on stage to very much sympathize with a guy in the audience who was criticizing some technology company speakers about, installation of, eventually 5G technology or creating smart cities to help these places, retain their youth with many technological opportunities. And there was a guy in the audience that said, how dare you come here and talk about all these standard issue things without remembering our history and who we are and so on and so forth. And he looked at me and he said, how dare you talk about things that have worked in the United States, that you're saying would work here. And I kind of grabbed the microphone and I said, you know what, you're absolutely right. I think you misunderstand me. I didn't say that at all. And I turned to these technology guys and I said, you're sounding like a couple of Americans. This is Portugal. This is crazy. You cannot operate without reference to your context. And so that led to this book. The reason I bring it up,
Yeah,
because I wrote the article in Planetus and Forget Smart, We Need Context Cities. That was the beginning of this book.
you talk a lot about the center of change and preservation as kind of a blending. Where did that idea first hit you, the blending discussion?
Oh, well, I think it first hit me in noticing the differences between a traditional American historic preservation battle, which is usually about tearing down a building or not for a new development. And then here, where heritage, as it's called here, is seen as a far more, immersive undertaking, because it's not as simple as one building and whether the building comes down or not. It's a question of blending new development with a strong sense of history or remaining older buildings. And it is a blend. To determine what that blend should be is a very contextual undertaking. And just like anywhere, some people do it very well and some people do it in absolutes. And here, for instance, I was just talking about this because I was just on a podcast here where a fairly well-known niche developer in East London, she was somewhat of an inspiration for some parts of the book, and she had me on her podcast, which was very nice. And I reminded her how valuable she'd been, because she talked about rebuilding at scale or redeveloping at scale using indigenous architects, if you will, who were simpatico with the community, who understood the importance of picking up the curve in the street, a blended approach to height, compatible building materials, but not an absolute devotion to London brick. In other words, preserving the essence, the look and feel without replicating. And it's kind of funny because, for projects, road resurfaces and so on, that do use, say, a traditional brick, often that brick is from China. It's no longer from Wales, England, or Scotland, number one. And number two, it goes to that strong sense of history that exists here. And so the blending, I mean, it almost has to blend unless something has been utterly destroyed. And there are so many factors that go into that blending that aren't just architectural. It can be an historic event. It can be, a piece of the landscape. It can be many, many things. And so the idea of heritage and so on and so forth is just it's much more multifaceted than sometimes we see in the United States. So that's how I first got deeply into the issue of blend. Also, my tendency to immerse and think too much about some things and say it's not black and white. It's not that simple. There's a shade of gray here. And that fits also, the blend fits with the bottom up, top down resolution of land use, really in many places in the world now. It's a burgeoning movement.
So, Chuck, if folks want to find the book, where can they find it?
Well, in the United States, it's easily obtainable on Amazon.com in both hardbound and Kindle form. And then it's also orderable from the publisher directly, Rowman and Littlefield. I can get everyone a 30% discount code, which I will provide to you, and you can put in the show notes.
Awesome. We also tell folks to go to bookshop.org, and you can support your local bookshop if you don't get a chance to go in.
Yes, absolutely, bookshop.org. We also push that over here in the UK. There may be a temporary unavailability moniker because the distributor happens to be restocking right now as of date of recording. But Bookshop, IndieBound, prominent local independents can, at a minimum, order it from the publisher.
And the book is Sustaining a City's Culture and Character, Principles and Best Practices. Chuck Wolfe, thank you so much for joining us. We really appreciate it.
No, it's a pleasure to come back again. It's very cool.
And thanks for joining us. The Talking Headways podcast is a project of The Overhead Wire on the web, theoverheadwire.com. Sign up for a free trial of The Overhead Wire Daily, our 14-year-old Daily Cities news list by clicking the link at the top right of theoverheadwire.com. And please support the pod on patreon.com/theoverheadwire. Many thanks to our current patrons for their ongoing support. And as always, you can subscribe to this podcast on iTunes, Stitcher, SoundCloud, Overcast, Spotify, and wherever you get your podcasts. And you can always find a digital home at usa.streetsblog.org. See you next time at Talking Headways.